Mr. Majeski's Anatomy 32 class. Chapter 1, Parts 1.5 through 1.8. This portion of the lecture we'll be talking about body cavities. And a cavity is basically a structure surrounded by bone and or muscle within which is either a space or, more likely, a soft organ of some or organs and glands. So in this image, we have a mid-sagittal section of the human body, and you can clearly see in it the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. So within the cranial cavity, we see the brain and the meninges, or three layers of membranes that surround the brain. And in the vertebral canal, you have the spinal cord and its associated meninges. And it turns out these two cavities are continuous with one another. So they have an open space that is open between these two cavities. So what are some other cavities found in the head? Examples can be the two ocular or orbital cavities. That has the eyes, the nasal cavity inside the nose, and the oral cavity where we have our tongue. In the trunk, we also see two large main cavities, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. And separating these two is the diaphragm. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity can also be further broken up into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And these two cavities don't have a set structure between them. So they are distinguished by the pelvic cavity being basically the structures found housed on top of the hip bones. Now, if we look closer at the thoracic cavity, we see that it also is broken down into some smaller cavities. These include the right and left pleural cavity, each holding one of the lungs, the pericardial cavity, that's holding the heart, and the mediastinum, which is basically the space between the lungs that house all those various structures found there, such as part of the esophagus, the trachea, and the heart. Now, part of the reason why we have these separate cavities in the thoracic cavity is because each lung and the heart is surrounded by its own serous membrane. Now, serous membrane is important because it does things like cushion the organ or organs found within it and provide a reduction of friction, and friction is the enemy of our body. So when you look at a serous membrane, you'll see that it has two layers, an outer layer referred to as the parietal layer, and the inner layer, that would be the visceral layer. And in between those two layers is some serous fluid that provides the cushioning and the reduction of friction. So for the right lung, for instance, you have the parietal pleura, which is running against the rib cage, and the visceral pleura, which is running against the lung itself. So a way to sort of think about this is to say you have a water balloon. I like to think of a water balloon because it's filled with a fluid. I think it's a better example than theirs. Anyway, you stick the fist into the water balloon and you'll have a layer of the balloon touching the fist, so that would be the visceral layer, or visceral serosa. And then you have the parietal serosa on the outside that's contacting whatever is out there. And of course the fist would be the organ itself. Here is another section of a body, this case a transverse section of the thoracic cavity. And what I like about this is you can see that space running around the lung, and that space is basically where you can have the serosal membrane, or in this case the right pleural membrane. And then you'd have a layer of it running against the rib cage, that would be the parietal pleural layer, and then the visceral pleural layer running along the lung itself. So it turns out there's also a serous membrane found in the abdominal cavity, and that's called the peritoneum. and it houses many of the organs, but not all of the organs in the abdominal cavity. Now, some of these organs that are within or surrounded by the peritoneum they are referred to as peritoneal organs. These include the stomach, the spleen, the liver, the gallbladder, part of the small intestine, and part of the large intestine, specifically the transverse colon. While the retroperitoneal organs are the organs found in that place that are not within or surrounded by the peritoneum. These include the kidneys, the pancreas, parts of the small intestine, parts of the large intestine, this would be the ascending and descending colon. Now, when you're studying the book, if you just focused on words in bold, you would see the peritoneum and its official definition. However, you would then end up skipping over further information in that section about specifically which organs are intraperitoneal and which organs are retroperitoneal. And that's important information. So remember, when you're studying the textbook, you need to understand more than just what's in bold. Now, when doctors and anatomists are looking at the human body, and specifically in this case looking at the abdominal pelvic area, they have found different ways of breaking that region up. So one way is what's referred to as the abdominal region. And so here you just imagine putting a tic-tac-toe grid on the abdominal pelvic area, where you have two parallel lines called the mid-clavicle lines, which you can imagine run from the midpoint of the clavicle all the way down. And then perpendicular to that, two parallel lines, the subcostal line, sub-below costal would be the ribs, so below the ribs, and the transtubicular line. Transtubicular because it's connecting 2 points at the tip of the hip bones. And each one of these 9 portions of this grid has its own special name. The right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, the left hypochondriac region are the 3 most superior regions. Inferior to those are the right lumbar region, the umbilical region, and the left lumbar region. And inferior to that is the right inguinal region, the pubic region, and the left inguinal region. Now these regions are most often used during autopsies. And if you cut in, you can see where you'd expect the various structures for those regions. The right portion of the liver would be found in the right hypochondriac region. The bulk of the small intestine would be found in the umbilical region, and so forth. Another way to divide up the abdominal pelvic region of the body is using quadrants. So therefore you're breaking this region up into 4 parts. And here you would just have the median line, which is the same as the midline, running perpendicular to the transumbilical line, which would run through the umbilical or the belly button. This approach is used most often by physicians to tell where a particular pain is in the patient, or where a growth or whatever is in. And these are called the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. Nice, simple, and straightforward. Now, let's move on to medical imaging. This is some of the amazing thing about modern medicine, is we no longer have to cut into a body to actually see inside that body and to see what's going on in that body. The most common form of medical imaging is through the use of X-rays. So here, the X-rays will show you where the dense structures are, and they will show up as white versus the less dense areas of the body. So here we have a radiograph of the chest. So you can see the ribs and the sternum and the heart as nice dense areas. They're nice and white, while the lungs, which are not very dense because they're mostly empty space, are kind of dark. Next to that is a mammogram, which is also another type of X-ray. And here, that big blob, white blob would be a potentially cancerous tumor. Other approaches that also use X-rays involve what's considered a sort of contrasting approach, basically coating various soft structures that aren't that dense with a denser substance. So, for instance, we see a barium contrast X-ray for looking for a cancerous tumor within the colon. An angiogram of a human adult, you can see where the arrow is pointing, you see that there's no blood flowing through that. It's blocked. And the intravenous urogram showing a kidney stone within a kidney. And here's that kidney stone is a rather large structure, and down here is a very thin tube that large structure is going to have to go through, which sort of explains why kidney stones are so painful. Other approaches include the magnetic resonance imaging. In this case is a sagittal section of the brain, which is basically using magnetic waves to look at the body and at what part of the bodies are very active. You also have below that a sonogram image of an infant that is in the mother's womb, and that is a healthy infant. You have to remember there's some other things that those sound waves are bouncing off of. You also can have endoscopy, where you're basically taking a camera and inserting it into the body. And then there's also computed tomography or CT scan. This itself is actually another use of X-rays, but it takes a whole bunch of X-rays in sequence so that you actually can see a 3D sort of structure. Hope you enjoyed that portion of the Chapter 1 lecture. Remember to study everything in the chapter because it will be on the exam.